Divas! So excited this week and next week. We have a two-part episode for you because we have the State University System Chancellor, Ray Rodrigues. That's right. We've got Ray Rod live in person, and you'll hear the first part of that episode this week and the second next. We talk about the complexities of the university system. We discuss the evolving landscape of DEI initiatives and so much more. So please join me today with State University System Chancellor Ray Rodrigues.
We've seen significant movement within what we're doing in general education. We've eliminated programs that now the president is requiring all universities to do through executive order. And we're ahead of the curve here in Florida because we started down that path years ago.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
Divas! Oh my gosh, I'm back here in the Speakeasy. Nice to be back here today on a sunny day in Tallahassee and with a special guest. And yes, he is in fact one of my OGs, but not from the role he's in now. We have with us the State University System of Florida Chancellor, Ray Rodrigues. Welcome to a Deeper Dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. It's my pleasure. I don't think I'm at the point where I should be talking about myself in the royal we yet. So we go way back from your time in the legislature. You were one of the architects of what I like to call, you're an OG from Potlandia. That's my word for the whole marijuana industry. But we won't be talking about that today unless there's some tangent to the state university system. And I saw you were looking through your materials that you brought. You probably have a lot you want to talk about. I have a lot of questions for you because higher ed, did you realize what you were getting into when you took over as chancellor?
I had an idea because, as you know, my day job when I served in the legislature was at a university down in Southwest Florida, Florida Gulf Coast University.
That's right.
I had 16 years experience before I left the legislature and took on the role as chancellor. What I didn't realize was just how busy we would be in terms of innovation in higher education over the last 3 years.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like a hotbed of controversy right now, too, because the governor and you and the boards are really, I don't think it's an overstatement to say there's like an overhaul of higher education underway, right?
I would agree with that. What I would say is 2 years ago, the Gallup organization does an annual survey where they measure the confidence of the American people in a variety of institutions in the country. And 2 years ago, they included higher education. They had not done that for several years. And the results came back that only 36% of the American public had confidence in higher education. And it just shocked everybody because the last time they had publicized the survey that included higher education had been in 2015, and it was around 60% at that time. So it had fallen significantly from then until 2023.
Did it say why? Did they have...
In the first survey, they did not.
Okay.
But it was shocking enough that other organizations tried to recreate it. So the FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, actually asked the very same questions. In Gallup's first one was June of 2023. FIRE did it in January 2024, and then again in May of 2024. Same exact questions that Gallup did. And got the same results. They got 31% in January, 28% in May. Now, I think the May 2024 was an outlier because at the time FIRE surveyed, we had graduation going on, and there were a lot of encampments, graduation ceremonies being canceled because of the protest. And I think there were a lot of negative headlines that artificially drove that number down. But the January 2024, right in line with what Gallup had.
2021.
2023.
2023. Okay.
And then FIRE was January 2024.
Okay.
And then in June 2024, Gallup did it again, but this time they were prepared. They asked why. So when the answer came back, lack of confidence in higher ed, Gallup followed that up and said, why have you lost confidence? Yeah. And there were three main reasons. The speculation was that the reason people had lost confidence was because of the cost and the student loan debt. That was actually number
It's a big
3.
deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal. That was the third highest reason why people had lost confidence. The second highest reason was a belief that degrees were not leading to jobs. So you had everybody knew someone who had gone to college, gotten a degree, and then couldn't get a job after they graduated. And then the number one reason, which was very surprising to the media, was a belief that higher education was more about indoctrination than it was education, pushing political ideology. What I would say from Florida's perspective is if you go back to Senate Bill 266 in 2023, where we eliminated DEI in higher education and we removed those concepts out of general education, the state of Florida, I believe, is the only state in the country who has taken action on all 3 of the reasons why the American public has lost confidence in higher ed. So from your point of it being an overhaul, I would agree with that in terms of we've seen significant movement within what we're doing in general education. We've eliminated programs that now the president is requiring all universities to do through executive order. And we're ahead of the curve here in Florida because we started down that path years ago.
You know, you brought up doing away with DEI, and I understand that the president is taking dramatic action in that area. What do you say? I mean, there's like people who think that these programs help to broaden the demographics on campus, that doing away with DEI, and, you know, there's like who gets to decide what actually fits under that umbrella, you know, negatively impact underrepresented students. What do you say to those concerns?
Well, I think that's a fair question, and I think those are fair concerns. And I always, when those questions come up, and they do when I'm having interviews with national publications,
I'm sure.
I start with, in Florida, you know, the primary DEI program is affirmative action. And that's what the Supreme Court ruled in the summer of 2023 that you can no longer utilize in college admissions. In Florida, we stopped affirmative action back in 1998.
I think that was Governor Bush, right?
It was Governor Jeb
had
Bush.
Governor Bush on the podcast last year. I'll tell you one of the things I wanted to mention about him. Yeah, go ahead.
That was the One Florida initiative.
That was One Florida.
So in Florida, we have not had affirmative action for more than a quarter of a century. Yet last summer, at the conclusion of spring semester, if you went back and looked at the data in Florida, nearly half of our bachelor's degrees that were awarded to students who self-identify as either African American or Hispanic. So I would submit, even without affirmative action, Florida has proven you can have a very diverse system and have success with your diverse student population.
Affirmative action is just one component of doing away with, you know, programs or offices. And I mean, I think that you could say that DEI programs may have helped to get Florida to those numbers. Even though we did away with affirmative action, there still were offices or programs or services that are offered to minority students, right? So I don't think that one necessarily negates the other. Am I wrong?
Well, I would say this. If that were true, then after we eliminated DEI, we should see the minority population, or the success of our minority students in Florida decrease, because we've now been years without those programs. And we haven't seen
How
that.
many years?
2 years.
Okay.
And we've not seen those numbers move. We continue to have the best numbers in the country when it comes to 4-year graduation rate for our African American students. We have the number 3 highest 4-year graduation rate for students who are Hispanic. And we have the number 1 graduation rate for students who receive a Pell Grant. And that's continued consistently even after the programs have gone away.
You know, we could spend the whole conversation talking about the DEI and all of what that, you know, how that's interpreted and what that means. But I appreciate you, you know, addressing it head on. And I wanted to kind of shift a little bit to something that you talked about. We're recording this today. It's a Thursday. It'll come out on Sunday. you addressed the Board of Governors just yesterday. And one of the things that you talked about is something else the president is doing, and that is a significant reduction in research funding for state universities. And I think I heard you say that it's running, that it's running from 15 to 70%, depending on which institutions or private institutions, but I think it's like a 15% cut that.
Let me clarify that.
Okay, please.
So with all sponsored research that a federal government agency provides, and there are multiple agencies where the bulk of the sponsored research comes from. National Institutes of Health does all of the healthcare research, and that's under HHS. National Science Foundation does the bulk of the scientific research. And then there's EPA, which also provides sponsored research for environmental projects. And then there's NOAA, which is specific to water projects. In NIH, which was the first agency that the president took action in, with those grants, you get a dollar amount specific to a project with deliverables of what you're supposed to do in the research. And a university gets what's called an indirect cost rate. So for every dollar they get to do on research, there are indirect costs that are required by the university to support the work of the grant. And that indirect cost rate at private Ivy League institutions was as high as 70%. So for every dollar of research, the university like Harvard or Columbia was getting another 70 cents to do the research, $1.70. In our system, our indirect cost rate was around 50%. What the president did was he cut it and said, we're only going to pay 15% as an indirect cost rate.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. I didn't, obviously, that was... It had a lot of math and my eyes started glazing over.
Well, it impacts everyone. We're impacted because as a system, our university system, our indirect cost rate has been around 50%. Whereas in the Ivy Leagues, it's 70% or even higher at some institutions.
Well, let's talk about, though, what that means going from 50% to 15%, right? This is just the health related or the health arena.
Correct. And the concern
silo.
is...
Let's use silo. You guys
that's
love
fine.
silo.
That's a great way to describe it. The concern is if the Trump administration is successful in changing the indirect cost rate to 15% in the health silo, that they will then proceed to do that in all federal sponsored research. The danger of that for the system is a 15% indirect cost rate makes it very difficult for us to do the research without losing money because our costs are greater than 15% of the grant.
Right.
Now, where the Trump administration is absolutely spot on is the current system isn't working and it's not set up properly. And I'll give you an example. The institutions who receive the greatest, and I'll give you two examples. I'm going to start with the first one. The institutions who receive the most research dollars from NIH are the Ivy League institutions who have the absolute highest indirect cost recovery rate. They're plus 70 to 75%. Now think about it. The law of economics says the more you do of something, the greater your economies of scale. There are no economies of scale being realized on the Ivy League campuses.
Why not?
Because the federal government's never required them to show it.
Oh, so you're saying because they're Ivy League, then what they have, like they're getting more money from supporters, and so they're
not
more
from supporters. I'm talking specifically.
I understand,
from the federal government.
But are you saying but okay?
Their reputation because they're Ivy Leagues is very high.
Right.
And so the federal government historically has not negotiated. They've just given them what's been asked.
But I'm saying, like, why is the ROA not good on that? Aren't they doing, great things with those research dollars?
The suspicion is, in theory, the indirect cost is paying for the facility that's being utilized to conduct the research and for the cost associated with that facility. So the bricks and mortar,
right? The
electricity to run it, the utilities around water, and
they're pricey. They're high paid professors, maybe.
Well, in theory, the workers doing the research are on the grant itself because we call that.
So they're getting paid through that.
Yeah, they're being paid through the grant, and in the business we call that soft dollars because it's dependent upon the grant. and hard dollars are if you're an employee of the university.
I see.
No matter what. So those people that are doing that work in theory are being paid from the grant.
Okay.
And it's all the auxiliary support to make the grant work that is being caught and captured and reimbursed in the indirect cost rate. The concern from the federal government is it's not costing them 75 cents on every dollar, and that the Ivy Leagues are making money off of the federal government because they have an artificially high indirect cost recovery rate.
I got you.
And that's part of the reason their endowments have grown so much, is because the federal government's helped fuel that growth, in addition to their very wealthy donors, which no one disputes the fact the Ivy Leagues have a lot of wealthy
So does
alumni.
Florida.
Yep. But a lot of wealthy alumni who are making significant contributions.
Yeah.
The federal government believes the federal government's indirect cost rate may be playing a role in their financial success.
I see. Okay, so that's one example. And then what was the other example?
The other example of this is, and I'll use our system. We have universities who have multiple grants from NIH because we do a lot of healthcare research within our state university system. Within the same university, getting grants from the same agency, you will have multiple indirect cost rates. So in theory, if a university has a grant with an agency, they should say, here's what it cost us to do this research. And every grant should have the same rate. But we'll have maybe 4 different rates across 4 different grants.
You know, there could be different costs for different kinds of research, right? You could be using humans in one and lab rats in another. And maybe that's a bad example. I don't know.
That's possible, but in theory, if it's the same university, same agency, the work's being done out of the same lab.
Okay.
Which begs the question, why don't we have a uniform cost recovery rate?
Even if you're using different equipment and stuff, or?
That could potentially impact it.
Right.
But is it truly material
How
enough?
large is that differential? Is it like 15 to 50, or is it like just 1 or 2? What's the spread, I guess?
I think the spread would be between 5 to 10% within our system. I don't know what it is elsewhere.
Okay.
And that's just one agency.
Right.
And so now we have universities that have multiple agencies that they're doing business with in terms of sponsored research, and none of them have a common indirect cost recovery rate.
Well, I have a friend who is a professor in another state university system who is on a grant, doing research on a grant, and they're very concerned about, in a health arena, very concerned about the impact that this loss of these federal dollars will be. I mean, and you expressed concern about it. This has been budgeted into, I think I heard, like the new hospital for FSU, right?
Yes.
Like they budgeted that federal funds into their debt service.
Just so we're clear, this is the facility that FSU intends to build in Panama City. They're bonding that out to have the funds to build the facility, and they pledged indirect cost recovery revenue as a revenue stream to pay for those bonds. So you're right.
Okay, I did get that right.
I just want to make sure everybody knows we're talking about Panama City.
Oh, right.
Which is the one they're going to go build, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Not here in Tallahassee.
Right.
But they pledged their indirect cost recovery
because
they have a track
big campus in Panama City.
They do.
Yeah.
Because they have a track record of how much revenue they've received from the federal government in indirect cost recovery that could be used to pledge that revenue. But the bond market is now very nervous because what we're seeing is a significant reduction in what the federal government has said they will pay. And what you may have heard yesterday in the report I gave to the Board of Governors, we are seeing that concern across the entire higher education sector. Harvard has a hiring freeze. Yale has a hiring freeze. The entire university system of California has a hiring freeze. Ohio State has a hiring freeze. Clemson, Purdue. Many of the major tier 1 research universities are placing a hiring freeze in effect until they see what's going to happen with the federal government and what they're going to do in terms of research.
Well, how long? I mean, that's got to be concerning because we're not far from the end of this semester, but I would imagine there's a lot of planning going on for the fall terms, right?
Yes,
so
it's very concerning because a number of these places were interviewing for their next admission for PhD programs
Right.
that they're going to put on hold because they don't know if they're going to have the research dollars to fund those programs.
Well, what are we doing? What are you doing? What is our state university system doing to try to, get your arms around that?
We have not enacted a hiring freeze, nor have we frozen admissions.
Okay.
However, part of the reason our universities can do that is we are very judicious in the use of our spending, in our spending. We're very conservative in our approach.
We're cheapskates.
I would say
we're thrifty. We're thrifty.
We're thrifty, and in times
Yeah.
like this, it pays
Yeah.
off.
Yeah.
While others who are not
Cheapskates.
as,
I take it back.
as thrifty as we are,
Right.
are having to come to a complete stop till they can figure out what to do, we know that we can continue to operate. And we are taking a look because in some of these areas, grants have been held up, but there's an indication that they're going to be funded. So there's a small gap between when the money will be received versus when the folks are working. Our universities are internally working through how to cover those periods, those gap periods with our internal funding. But we all believe we can address that challenge.
That's interesting because I think, this is not meant as a pejorative reflection at all, but I've been following the president's tariffs things, and it's like, oh, today it's a 25% tariff on, Canada or Mexico, or on wine from France, and then, oh, no, we're not going to do that. And then like the next day, oh, yep, it's a 20, you know what I mean? Like there's been a lot of doing not announcements or something, and then back and forthing, and so that creates a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. And I mean, the marketplace of higher education is a marketplace too.
Within higher ed, there's a theory that what the president may have done with this announcement, because he made the announcement that the 15% was effective immediately, and so we're in contracts with the federal government. The federal government has signed a contract with the university to say, you do this research, we're going to give you this much money with this as an indirect cost recovery rate. And to come into an existing contract and say, we're only going to pay you 15 cents instead of 50.
Right.
That has led to litigation, not from Florida, but from other universities. And a judge has placed an injunction on the federal government for that. The belief is that litigation will be lost by the federal government, that you can't go into the middle of a contract and just change the terms unilaterally. My suspicion is, I think the president knew that. I think the president knew there would be litigation. I think the president knew that round of litigation would not be won. But the president also knows that there are going to be a new round of contracts negotiated for the upcoming fiscal year. And I think he was saying to the world, the negotiations don't start at 70%.
Right.
They start at 15%.
I see.
I'm not negotiating you down from 70%. You're negotiating me up from 15%.
I gotcha.
And so I think it was a bargaining tactic. And I think it's going to be very successful.
That's very interesting.
I think the president's going to lower the indirect cost recovery rate. I think it's going to be something that will continue to allow research to occur. And I think it's going to be a good deal for the federal government.
Do you think it'll be a good deal for the Florida university system? And what impact do you think it'll have? Do you think that it will curtail the amount of research that's being done?
I think it will definitely reduce the amount of indirect costs that's provided. The question is, when the federal government saves that money, what do they do with it? Do they fund additional projects? Because all research isn't funded every year. They go through, they vet, they say, here are worthy projects, and here's the budget of what we can fund in terms of research and with the cost recovery. And so maybe, there's within our system of 12 universities, maybe there's 1,000 worthy projects, but only 800 of them get funded because that's what the federal government has within the individual agencies. If you've negotiated down the indirect cost recovery rate, that's now more money that's available for the federal agency. In theory, instead of there being 800 projects, perhaps the whole 1,000 projects get funded because now they
get funded at a smaller
Well, with the smaller indirect cost recovery rate,
right.
those savings could
you
be
can
plowed
spread
into
it
additional
around
savings.
more.
Exactly. So
right.
at this point, no one knows what the federal government's going to do with those savings. They could either do more research, they could just lower the cost and say we're going to keep our rate of research flat at the same level. Everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen.
That's so interesting. What do you think?
I wouldn't hazard a guess at this point.
And right now, the specific areas of research that are most vulnerable to these cuts are healthcare, but you think they're going to be coming in other silos.
The indirect cost rate is healthcare. The National Science Foundation, which is the second largest silo of sponsored research, they were looked at as an agency and they were downsized. So there are fewer employees in the National Science Foundation now, which impacts the amount of sponsored research that they can do because they don't have the employees to process them. So there's a very real concern that you're going to see the grants that come through National Science Foundation reduced.
What would be an example of that? Can you give me an example?
I can't off the top of my head.
I'm thinking maybe like Mag Lab, stuff like that goes on at the Mag Lab.
That's a possibility. I think they definitely would not be NIH. They would more likely be National Science Foundation.
Are you concerned about that?
Everyone is concerned about what's going to happen with the National Science Foundation because that's not just we're reducing the indirect cost recovery rate. That is, there's less cash going out the door because there's less employees available to process the applications. So everyone's worried about what the net effect of that is going to be.
So stay tuned.
Exactly.
And we'll be right back with Chancellor Ray Rodrigues. And you know what time it is, divas. It's that time. The news in haikus. The news in haikus. That's right. It's the news in haikus. Igniting young minds. Knowledge flows through hallowed halls. College football rules. There you have it, divas. The news in haikus. Don't forget, we'd love to hear your haiku. You can slide them into my DMs or you can send them to podcasts, that's podcasts with an S, at e.newsserviceflorida.com. Wherever you're listening, please don't forget to subscribe and give us a rating if you like what we're doing. And we are back with Chancellor Ray Rodrigues. I want to talk about something else that's I've become. It's so funny because like the Potlandia stuff, well, maybe back in the day. So that kind of fits into my persona, covering that as a beat. But I have been writing about the ACC and FSU. So I'm like the person who lives in Tallahassee who has been to maybe 2 FSU games, even though I have a degree from FSU. So I'm kind of an outlier here in town. But the NIL is a big deal, and that's the name, image, and likeness where athletes are getting paid to perform. There's a settlement looming, and I think some states, or maybe South Dakota, is challenging that. What specific states is the state university system taking to prepare for like an anticipated economic fallout from that, or is that not the right question?
No, I think you're on the right path. So there's an athlete, a swimmer, I think from Stanford, whose last name was House, who sued the NCAA and said Stanford University and the NCAA, because Stanford's a member of the NCAA, have financially benefited from my labors as an athlete, and I've not been able to share in that revenue. So I believe I've been taken advantage of. Specifically, you have used my name, image, and likeness, but you have not allowed me to profit from my name, image, and likeness. And rather than litigate it, the NCAA reached a settlement and said, we're going to pay you. And it was a class action. So they said, we're going to pay all athletes who were active in any sport in the NCAA from this time period. and they laid out what the time period is. It's like a 10-year period. I'd have to go look it up to tell you specifically what 10
Yeah,
years.
but we're talking. We're having a conversation. We're not grading you on
On the details.
right.
So they said, we're going to pay. And what we're also going to do in this settlement is we're going to change the way the NCAA and the universities operate going forward. So currently, universities are not allowed to pay athletes. You can give them a scholarship. That's the extent of it. But athletes can benefit from name, image, and likeness. So what happens is collectives are formed,
Yes.
which are funded primarily by alumni and donors.
Yeah. Boosters,
Who then raise the money and pay an athlete a name, image, and likeness deal.
Yeah.
Now,
I learned a lot about this system through one of the lawsuits that I wrote about, but I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
Go ahead.
So
it's quite interesting.
And I'm putting air quotes here that your viewers can't see. They're paying them under a name, image, and likeness deal, but they're not paying them fair market. They're just paying them to play. Yeah. So they're calling it name, image, and likeness.
Sometimes they get fancy cars. Yes. Sometimes they get cash money. Sometimes they get whatever.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
The starting quarterback for the University of Georgia did not enter the NFL draft. Instead, entered the transfer portal, went to the University of Miami, and if what's been reported in the news is correct, he will earn more playing for the University of Miami next year than 4 projected starting quarterbacks in the NFL will earn playing professional football.
What's that dollar amount?
I think he's earning between $4 and $5 million for the year.
That's crazy.
And you've got some starting NFL quarterbacks that are on their rookie deal that are earning less than that, on their first deal.
Wow.
And then after he went to Miami, he was in the news because he was a victim of a crime. 2 of his vehicles were stolen. I don't remember what they were. One was a very high-end sports car.
Fancy schmancy.
Yeah. Either like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini.
I remember
and the other
that.
was like a very high-end luxury car, like a Mercedes or something.
Right.
And that was all more likely than not the product of a name, image, and likeness deal, either from Miami or from Georgia when he was at Georgia. Who knows?
Right.
But I'm sure when he graduated high school, he didn't graduate with a Lamborghini and a Mercedes.
Right.
So that's what the current system is. It's athletes who are being compensated, not by the university, but through the collectives, allegedly for name, image, and likeness. But truly, it's because the boosters want them to play on the team.
Yeah. I mean, that whole NIL thing is like a fan dance, but go ahead.
The NCAA has said with this settlement, we're now going to authorize universities to pay athletes. So universities have to make a choice. They can stay in the status quo, which is they cannot pay their athlete, and there will be
do this collective.
A collective, and whatever it raises, it can do. Or you can pay your athletes, but if you pay your athletes, you can't do the name, image, and likeness collective, and there's a salary cap. You can only pay as a university $20.5 million for all of your athletes distributed across each of your sports.
Oh, great.
Yes.
So now you're going to have the boys get paid more than the girls. And
that remains to be seen because
this person gets paid more than the guy who played last year. And how do you, the whole idea of monetizing kids they're kids when they come into college if they're freshmen, right? What do you think about that?
I think it was a lot simpler when you gave scholarships and that was it. And if a kid wanted to come to a university and play ball, they knew that they were getting a great education and an opportunity to play for a coach who in theory could prepare them for the next level if they had the talent to go there.
I just wonder about the pressure that these young athletes are under, when they're seniors in high school or they're juniors in high school or whatever. And, they're people, the agents, like some of the stuff I've read in the lawsuits, they're being manipulated by people who are affiliated with the collectives or, being told one thing and then something else happens and their family members might not be the most sophisticated about this high dollar world. And in the meantime, are they supposed to even bother going to classes? Is that all just a joke? Are they actually are they actually students, or are they really just athletes and, they're enrolled in classes? I don't know. It seems...
It's a fair question in today's day and age, because think about it. Now, I'm ancient, so let's start there.
If you're ancient, I'm not even living, so...
When I went to college, it was a previous century, and the numbers started with 19.
Right.
But when I was in college, it was not unusual for me to be sitting in class next to an athlete. Because
I went to the University of Michigan, and I was in a co-ed dorm, and on the other side of the door of my wall was the Rose Bowl winning football team.
Yep. And you saw them on campus.
Yeah. One of them was a Rhodes Scholar.
There you go.
Yeah.
So it was common to be in classes with athletes. They were truly student athletes. And when they played in a conference, which was generally regionally based, which meant when they went to away games, they weren't that far away. So if you were in the Southeastern
Conference,
the
travel
wasn't significant because you were...
Oh, you weren't going to Ireland to play?
Well, that's different.
I understand.
That's like an event,
I understand, but you weren't going, other than championship games, you weren't traveling all around the country.
And today, with the advent of super conferences, it's not unusual for today's athletes to be traveling all over the country in order to get their regular schedule of games done. So how many classes are they missing? So
exactly.
What's happened today is many of those athletes are in online classes, and they're being tutored as part of their
They have
education.
a tutor and a note taker, and they get some test that says that they have, they have special need, whatever. Like they need a note taker and you know what I mean? Like they get a lot. They get all the things.
As athletes is their sport, and then work with their education support.
I'm not disparaging athletes, by the way. Let me
I'm not
make
either.
it clear. I have a lot of admiration for these kids.
I'm just saying, in today's day and age, the concept of the student athlete is not what we would have recognized.
Right.
As a student athlete.
Thank you.
30 years ago.
Much better articulated than what I was saying.
And the pressure on them today, I would say, is much greater than what the athletes in my generation had placed on them. So the stakes are much higher, and the burden of being an athlete is much higher, given the practice schedule, the travel schedule, and the expectations that are placed on them.
So should we just should we just get these kids and pay them and forget about the education part of it and just have them be, mascots, or, you know what I mean? Should that be the way?
It has been speculated that private equity groups are now looking at the opportunity for college athletics.
Oh, really?
In terms of creating alternative leagues.
Wow.
And you'll have affiliations with universities, but maybe not necessarily the actual university team.
Wow. Interesting.
Our vice chair of the Board of Governors said at our meeting yesterday that he believes in 5 years, the landscape of college athletics will end up looking completely different than it looks today.
I believe that's probably true.
Yes.
There's just so much money involved too.
And that's a game changer.
Yeah.
From 30 years ago when
100%.
When money could not be involved outside of the scholarship.
Right. Should FSU leave the ACC? What do you think about that deal?
If what I read most recently is correct, I think they've reached a settlement with the ACC. In terms of
they reached a settlement.
They're going to
it doesn't say they're going to leave. I mean, it reduces their exit payout. I think it goes down over time, and it won't be in the hundreds of millions. It'd be in the tens of millions.
And I think Clemson, based upon the ratings that they generate in television, will get a much bigger payout from the ACC than they were receiving before.
They're going to get more money.
Right. And that was their concern, was they competitively were at a disadvantage with teams in the SEC because the SEC had a better contract with their network provider than the ACC had negotiated with the network
ESPN.
provider.
Yeah.
And so I think two things have happened. One, I believe ESPN renegotiated the deal with the ACC. And two, the ACC is internally agreed to a different revenue sharing model that will reward the teams that are drawing in the viewers for the TV.
Yeah.
And so I think FSU and Clemson are going to be more satisfied with the deal than they were when the litigation began. For
sure. That's true. And don't forget to join us next week for part 2 with State University System Chancellor Ray Rodrigues.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC.